Stanley. Simon, over to you. Simon is associated with the EBRD, and I think you've also written a book on, well, books, stacks of books on the computer industries, and you've also been at ODI before, haven't you? over to you.
Okay. Thanks. So I'll be very brief on what is a nice piece of work and an ambitious piece of work, because it's after, in a way, one of the most sort of fundamental issues of modern international economics, which is how was it that two low-income countries with lots of very unskilled people in them suddenly sort of jumped into doing things that that involve quite a lot of skills and doing it successfully, both in terms of exposure externally in export markets, but also by developing their own domestic markets, albeit with some important differences. And I think that, I mean, I congratulate the authors on a nice piece of work. The addition probably to the literature is they've also gone and done a sort of 300 firm interviews. They've got some new data. And they throw a lot of light on the dynamics of these sectors, of this big sector and there's two components of it in these two countries. They're things that I don't particularly go with in their argument, but I'll skip over them and then stay on the big issue, because in a way, I think Neil's summing up sort of goes to the heart of it, and certainly what makes me find this interesting is having had these experiences and having, as it were, some discontinuities in development paths in these two places, what does it tell us more generally that might be relevant to other countries? And as Dirk mentioned, you know, I spent some of my time at EBRD and editing the transition report for many years, and last year we focused indeed on the role of industrial policy. And I think, to put it in context, the way I'd think about it is a little different. It's like this. Industrial policy has, I suppose, two components. One which we see very much present in the UK or in France or anywhere right now, which is that if firms with a lot of employment or a lot of weight in bargaining, political and otherwise, get into trouble, then you have to work out whether you're going to subsidise them. In other words, you know, is it because they're in a temporary slough or is it not? And, you know, a lot of good decisions and a lot of very bad ones get taken in that. The more fundamental issue, I think, is what happens when you have an economy that has a production structure, an endowment structure, which doesn't simply make it very easy for it to diversify. And Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard has some very interesting arguments where he sort of thinks about it as a forest, and almost, and the big issue is, to what extent are the trees in the forest relatively close to each other? And I quite like the metaphor. And his idea, which he then sort of gives a sort of almost an ODI-like touch to, is of an African forest almost, where you have monkeys jumping around, and the question is whether a monkey can jump to one tree or to another. And if there are big spaces between, you can't jump. And that could be a metaphor for India as well. And my question, therefore, is to put it in that context. How is it that these countries, in a way, made a big jump? And I think, in point of fact, there are actually big differences between the two of them, both in terms of how far they jumped and B, what the role of policy was. My take on it is this, and it's slightly different, but it's not necessarily contrary to what the two authors have said. My take on it is this, that in a sense the Chinese didn't jump very far. They went along the line of doing what they had been basically developing, doing well over the last 40 years. And that is in highly, quite capital intensive and also quite manufacturing intensive activities, building plants, building things that got exported abroad and the like. So where the rub of it was essentially the construction of tangible materials. And I think, in a sense, their predominance, or the dominance of hardware relative to software, that really simply reflects, in a sense, their path, where they've built up their capabilities and how they've deployed them. They then deployed it, in some sense, into hardware rather than in software. And in that way, though as impressive as so many other aspects of the Chinese growth experience, I don't find it necessarily as big or as interesting an intellectual problem as the Indian one. Having said that, by the way, I think there are many issues in China relating to this sort of business environment stuff that probably also are quite relevant for why it's hardware rather than software, not least of all things like lack of intellectual property rights and so on and so on. But that's a little bit of an aside. Now, why is India interesting, it seems to me? And I think the book, in a way, confirms it, although you also have a slightly different take. And, well, because I think India is actually much more a real leap, a discontinuity in the Haussmann sense, than China. And the question, therefore, is, if India didn't really seemingly have these capabilities to do something new like this, why was it suddenly able to? Why, you know, how did it become such a monumental fluke, almost? And I think the question, therefore, goes back to the similar one that Neil and Stanley are looking at. Now, they argue that actually it was, in a sense, well-designed industrial policy, and Neil invoked the name of Rajiv Gandhi, who I think had very good intentions. I'm not sure, actually, there was well-designed industrial policy, but the thing I would really put down is that for India to make the leap that it was going to do, it required basically two things. One was enormous prior investment in higher education, in tertiary education. And basically an educational strategy that ran against all the advice that the UK or the World Bank or anyone else was giving them at the time. And they did that, and they created the Indian Institutes of Management, Indian Institutes of Technology, and a large tertiary education sector. And without that, it would have gone nowhere. The second is, as Neil pointed out, certain enabling decisions. For instance, to allow Texas Instruments in, to put VSATs in, establish almost, in a sense, enclaves which allowed communication, the development of links to export markets and the like. And I think that was also very important. And the third, which is the combination, it seems to me, of diaspora, external discipline effects, although it's probably true that people in Silicon Valley weren't necessarily the main investors or even sponsors of Indian software, I think in ways that are less tangible than one might imagine, this was extremely important and is so to this day. And there's quite a lot of cross sort of network type effects, investment, flows of people increasingly as wages have converged at the top ends of the skill distribution and so on. So I think, in a sense, the Indian thing is really the very interesting, is the more interesting, for at least for me, trying to think about how it is that countries which have certain sets of skills but want, as it were, to go up the tree, may be constrained. How do they get up? Now, how many general lessons can be drawn out of this? So if I was putting myself in the shoes of a Russian policymaker, which has a very atomized structure of production, a lot of inheritance from the past, much of which is fair crap, and stuff, little sort of pockets of high-tech stuff without any densities around. Would I think that India, or China for that matter, would offer the way forward, at least in policy terms? Well, actually, the Russians and quite a few others have tilted at these windmills, and they're basically tilted at it in two ways. One is trying to set up special economic zones, giving preferential treatment and the like. The second is sort of taxation regimes, and they're often overlapping with the first. The third, of course, is finance. And this is, I think, where the lessons that come out of all this are much more muddy. The Indian software sector basically got going with private finance under what are clearly hard budget constraints, bar the fraud at Satyam. And if you think about it that way, then in a sense, one of the key industrial policy tools, which is financing, is essentially absent in that world. Now, if you look across at China, that's not true. Actually, I mean, but partly because it's very hard to find out how things are financed. I had a student at LBS, Chinese student, who was looking at ownership and financing of firms using a very interesting data set from China of lots of firms. But he was really unable to pin anything down very much because measurement issues, transparency and the like was so poor. But I think one of the things that comes out is that certainly in software and in R&D, the Chinese have used a lot of public finance, public monies. And the returns to it, I suspect, have been trivial, if not negative. Yes, the Chinese have enormous amounts of R&D, but the amounts of patents that they generate for that R&D, let alone the returns to the patents, is very small indeed. Secondly, if you look at the software stuff, and here I'm just simply going by a chapter in a book that I did by Anna Saxenian, who I think knows a lot about these matters. I mean, if you look at the domestic industry in software, much of it is driven by sort of dubious demand being created by rungs of Chinese government for Chinese software products to displace Microsoft and other foreign software tools. And I think if you really could get at the numbers, which I don't think anyone ever will, so forget about it as an empirical exercise. I think if you did, you'd find the payback was exceedingly small, if not negative. So let me conclude. I think, at risk of repetition, that there's some very interesting things in this book. It really addresses one of the fundamental questions of our time. It gives some interesting explanations and answers. For instance, it comes out in the end sort of saying that national differences or cultural aspects seem to matter. You know, I'm not sure I actually agree with that. I mean, it may be true. It's just almost, I think, impossible to verify. And other issues like management seem to be important from their regressions as a residual. And you can always think, you know, if you did a conventional productivity regression, you had a la Solo, and the residual, in a sense, was bundled up in that, might be management or whatever. Again, I don't know whether that's quite right, because there's so much endogeneity slopping around. But, for instance, there's some very good work going on in this town by John Van Reenen and Nick Bloom at LSE on measuring management, actually trying to work out what is good management, what is bad management. And it's very tricky stuff, but I think anyone who's interested in that might want to also look at that. I think charts something very interesting in the way forward. So I think, you know, there's a sort of reasonably random selection of comments on a thoroughly interesting book, so I'm glad to have the opportunity to comment on it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon, for these